Welcome to Profiles in Purpose. On this episode, I'm with Sensei John Hanratty. He's someone I've known for about 35 years since I was a teenager and first joined his dojo in Calgary, Alberta. I'm actually joining him today in his home office. It's a wonderful setting because we have a lot of books here, and I'm sure we'll talk about those in a bit. They reflect his interests and passions. Thank you, Sensei Hanratty, for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome, Dan. Nice to see you.
So by way of introduction, I just want to tell people that you've been practicing and teaching Shotokan karate for well over 50 years. You're an 8th degree black belt, 8th Dan black belt in Shotokan karate. Can you take us back a bit and maybe tell us when you first became introduced to karate? And do you remember your first feelings when you first entered a dojo?
Yeah, I started in Liverpool, England, with probably the most famous club in England, the Red Triangle Karate Club. Actually, I should go back a bit. It was a Red Triangle instructor that introduced me to the Red Triangle, a guy called Frank Vernon. He was one of the original founders of the Karate Union of Great Britain, which is the biggest organization in the UK, probably in Europe. So I started training with Frank in a dance club in Prescott. It was a community centre, but a dance club used it. It didn't last long. The floor was awful. We used to end up with feet that were black, looked like we were wearing black socks by the time you got off the floor. So there was usually a line up for the sink that was in the kitchen there, so you could wash your feet before you put your socks back on. And I remember Sensei Onoida, very famous Japanese instructor, who'd come over from Japan with the wave of JKA instructors that Nakayama and Nishiyama had produced in the late 40s and early 50s. And these guys were absolute magic. But they trained 2 to 3 times a day every single day, whereas we were all working for a living and, it was a little bit harder. So I remember when I first saw Sensei Onoida, the guy had so much charisma. He was such a presence. It was unbelievable, just the way he carried himself. This was my introduction to Japanese karate, which is vastly different from the way it's taught these days and what purported to be karate and is put out as karate. It's an absolute shame, It's the same as calling a mosh pit ballroom dancing, as far as I'm concerned.
And so how old were you at this time?
Actually, I was a little older than most people. I was 25. This was late 1969, 70. A lot of people, they start karate in pre-teens. But we had a rule at that club. You couldn't start until you were 12 or 14, I think, which is probably why one of the most famous karateka around, Frank Barron, wasn't at the club when I first joined because he wasn't old enough at that time.
Oh, wow.
But he was on the waiting list. I mean, you couldn't stop him. He'd watch every class.
You mentioned it was traditional training. Can you paint a bit of a picture of how intense was this training?
Yeah, I think what attracted me to it was the discipline and the repetition and the insistence on getting things right. And to get anything right, it's practice, right? And so we had constant repetition. And you'd often see old pictures of JKA training where they're doing a technique over and over and over again. Now, a lot of my students really get a little bit irritated when I go, let's do that again, until they get it right. In fact, I always admonish them that you're not going to do it till you get it right, you're going to do it till you can't get it wrong. This is an old saying in karate, it's like get knocked down 7 times, get up 8. It's the same thing, you work it until you can't get it wrong. Now, it may be boring to some, it may be tedious, it's definitely hard on the body, but you're going to end up with a technique that will serve you well if you ever have to use it. And so it appealed to me, put it that way. The whole discipline thing appealed to me. And we were lucky enough to have instructors that understood how it worked and how you did it. The thing is, we were probably being instructed in the Japanese way, which was do it, do it, do it. Whereas the Western way is why. So we just did it. Eventually we found out why. It became more than obvious why. It's just a different outlook between East and West.
So you were 25, you were living in Liverpool. Yep. What kind of work were you doing at the time?
Well, I was in mechanics by trade. I'd been all sorts of things from when I was young. I went away to sea at a very early age and had sailed all around the world, so I had a pretty broad perspective on life. I'd been in the army. I was on maintenance in the army, maintenance and recovery, so I had a good mechanical background. And for a short while I'd earned a living as a mechanic. The army put you through all sorts of courses and stuff, and they give you a bit of help. And actually I was employed, when I first started karate, I was employed by the Territorial Army, which is like the National Guard, as a mechanic looking after their equipment. And I was into all sorts. We were on one of the first skydiving teams that were ever formed in the UK. I was doing skydiving on weekends and stuff like that. But that was too expensive for me, paying for planes and stuff. Karate was a cheaper thing, and it appealed more to my nature, if you like. I'm not aggressive. I probably was then, but I've mellowed out over the years. But it appealed to me. So I think at the time I started my karate, I was working at a Jaguar Rover dealership, and then I managed to get a license plate for a cab. The taxis in themselves aren't worth a lot, probably the same price they are today, but the license plate on the back of the taxi is what allows you to make money, because they were, at that time, quite restricted. There was only 300 of them in Liverpool at the time. That's what I did. I ended up with a few cabs. I had drivers I employed in the daytime, so I drove a cab when they went driving it at night. And extremely precarious career, if you like, because Liverpool is one tough town, extremely tough. Kind of makes the Bronx look like a kindergarten, if you like. People didn't look on you so much as a mode of transport as a means of making a few bucks easy. That was just the way it was. And as I say, I was a war orphan from 1945 when I was born. My parents disappeared, and so I'd kind of come up fighting for space, if you like. So that didn't really bother me. It wasn't that karate made me a fighter or I used all the techniques I'd learned, but it did give me a lot more options, and it kind of settled me mentally. When trouble did arise, I knew I could handle it. It gave me a lot more confidence. And having a lot of confidence actually negates a lot of aggression in other people. If you're confident, it's going to, shut them down. The last thing anybody expects if they're coming at you is for you to appear confident. If a person attacks you, they think they're going to win, otherwise they wouldn't attack you. They're the same as a burglar going into a house. They never think they're going to get caught, otherwise they wouldn't go in. So it's the same attitude. Once you realise that that's the attitude that they've got, unless you've got a bunch of mates behind him, if it's a one-on-one, you're pretty secure. You can pretty much dissuade them just with your attitude, even if you're just a little short guy like me. It's the attitude that you have,
Right, and you mentioned the structure and the discipline of the dojo and how that appealed to you. Can you go back a little bit, though, to talk a little bit more about that childhood you mentioned of post-war Liverpool?
Yeah.
What was the city like in those years following the war when you were growing up? And what kind of experiences did you have as a child that affected, your temperament, and why structure and discipline might have appealed to you later on?
Well, Liverpool was pretty much bomb flat. They had some terrible bombing raids come over Liverpool. It was the biggest port in the world at the time. And, of course, the Germans knew this, and they blitzed Liverpool. So when I was born and we were looking around Liverpool, there was a lot of bomb sites, call them bommies, where the buildings had just been flattened and bulldozed down. And what they did with all the rubble was they took it out to the beach that was just north of Liverpool. And it's still there today. You go in, you can see bricks and rubble from different houses that were bombed. Now, growing up in that kind of place, you're playing on bomb sites. You've got post-war housing, which wasn't much, and I moved a lot from family to family. Definitely nothing permanent. Originally, I started off with maternal grandparents, but they were overwhelmed with other kids. At that time, people had a lot of children. They just played the numbers game because of infant mortality. Now, the majority of people in Liverpool are probably Irish and Welsh descent. This is no accident. This was part of the British government's plan. When Ireland was taken over, if you have to go back to Cromwell, He gave most of the land to the English lords. English lords worked the Irish peasantry to work the land, and then a potato blight hit in the mid-1800s, and it decimated the population. They starved. So most of them left, and the first port of call they went to was Liverpool, and 90% of the Irish that emigrated to the States came through Liverpool. So there was 3 steps, right? If you didn't have the money to leave Ireland, you starved and you died. If you had the money, you headed to Liverpool. If you had enough money, you left from Liverpool, usually to the States or to Canada. If you didn't have enough money, you stayed in Liverpool and you lived in slums. And that's where I come from. I was 3rd generation Irish. So unfortunately, that's background history, the social history. Now, Liverpool also was a major seaport and was very influential and very involved in the African slave trade. So it was one point of what was called the Golden Triangle. Raw cotton would come from the States through Liverpool to the Lancashire mills, and then the cotton would be exported from there, and slaves would come from Africa to Liverpool and then onto the plantations in the south of the US. So it's quite a cosmopolitan history in Liverpool. It's probably got one of the oldest Chinatowns in the world, and definitely one of the oldest African people's settlements in the world. It's a very cosmopolitan place. Very. I wouldn't say that there was racism. There definitely wasn't racism. It's probably one of the least racist places in the world because it's been settled by this mixture of people for so long. Almost everybody in Liverpool come from, well, families that come from elsewhere.
Are there times where you remember feeling unsafe as a child?
Always.
Yeah?
Yeah, that's what gives you the edge. There's nothing safe. If you were out with your mates and you were playing around, that was great. But I remember where I lived, right down in the dingle on the river, the nearest place that you could go climb a tree was like 4 or 5 miles away in Sefton Park. So you just didn't see it. There were no trees. All the railings around people's houses had all been took up for the war effort. There wasn't much around, so it was pretty sparse. And rationing was in effect right up until the 50s. So food was quite scarce.
So that karate training when you started when you were 25, was that the first formal training in physical fighting that you had ever had? No,
I boxed when I was a kid. And in different schools I went to, went through about 4 or 5 different schools till I was about 14, 15. I boxed in almost all of them from when I was about 8. And managed to make the boxing team on a few, managed to make the city finals a couple of times, but I knew I was never going to be a professional boxer. It was just a way of getting, I don't know, the frustration out, if you like. And boxing certainly wasn't as methodical or structured as karate, as far as I was concerned. You come in, you go, okay, punch the bag or skip rope, whatever, you know. Definitely wasn't the structure that I think I probably needed. I needed a structure, and the other thing that I liked was I felt like I was a part of a big something. I liked that. I tried it with the army, it just wasn't me. With the army, the people who got promoted were stupid. You just got promoted because you were there the longest or you sucked up the most. Like I went into the army, and one thing I was good at, besides engines, was reading maps. I would read a map like I read a book. Like you don't need to these days with GPS, but at one time it was quite an art. And I had people that were supposed to be officers, they get lost in their own backyard, even if they had a map. If they fell over, they'd have a job finding the ground, put it that way. They were all upper class twits. England has a class system, just like every other country, I guess. But the class system there is more than obvious, and it just gets up your nose. But when I started karate, the guy at the front definitely knew more than me. Right? I wanted to learn, and I wanted to do what he was doing, and I wanted to do it as good as, if not better.
Sounds like he had earned your respect because you could see that he was competent at what he was doing.
Anybody who can show me that they know more than me on any subject, I'll listen to you. You know, I don't have fixed ideas in my head. I'll definitely, if you've got a point, and it's a reasonable point, I'll accept it, and then I'll research it, and then I'll come back to you and say you were right or you're full of crap. You know.
Yes. You mentioned earlier that you found the training calming. Calming in what way? Like, did you have some anger because of the way you grew up? Calming in what way?
Well, the way it's calming is probably anybody who does karate a lot will tell you that when you go into a dojo, everything outside the dojo disappears. And that includes whatever's bothering you that day or at that moment. You take your emotions and you analyze them. And you can be either apprehensive, angry, or fearful, right? If you're fearful, look at it. You're fearful about something that hasn't happened. Fear is always about something that's in the future. And anger is always about something that's in the past. You can be apprehensive, but you can deal with that. You look at a situation you might be apprehensive about, you weigh up all the pros and cons, and you make your decisions and you deal with it. Now, it's not that complicated when you're in a confrontation. To me, violence, even controlled violence like you have in a dojo, is a means of communication. It might be the ultimate means of communication because you get your points across real fast. Right? Now, whether you're right or wrong, depends on your point of view. But karate to me was mostly for self-defense, and I've been defending myself all my life on my own, and I wasn't bad at it, but it made me better. And it made me better for the fact that I appreciated what I could do and how I could do it.
Something you mention in your memoir, Hanratty on Karate, Training the Body and Mind, is that in the dojo you feel that you're at your best.
You have to be at your best, and you maybe not always at your best. You're always going to come away some days with a feeling that I could have done much better. I wanted to do more. Or I do anyway. Some people just can't wait to get out the dojo, but I've never rushed out the door. I've never left the class earlier unless I was injured or something like that. What I mean by that is you have to give it your best. Otherwise, you're not being true to yourself, and you're definitely not being true to any partner you're working with if you're not doing your best to try to employ the technique that you are.
Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, you've been teaching and training for more than 50 years now. You've taught at seminars all over the world, in Europe, Japan. I'm sure there's many other places I'm not mentioning. And you've put some of your teaching in the Shotokan Instructor's Handbook, which is the second of your books in addition to the memoir. What is it about teaching that's made you stick with it for so long? Like, it just seems to be very central to who you are.
It is now. It wasn't, to be honest with you. When I first came to Canada, the first thing I did was look for a karate club to train at. I was only knee dan, second dan. Came over here when I was 35 years old, so I'd already had good 10 years training in the UK. And 35, as far as I'm concerned, you're just up about the peak of your abilities. Started producing quite good competitors, good karate people. And in fact, there wasn't anybody in Alberta that could beat us. And the common complaint was, you guys train too hard. One of the top teams in the country, we took the national title in 92, and every member of that team was from my club. So
wonderful. And so, as you say, so more than 40 years ago, you started your dojo here in Calgary. You're still teaching and training in your late 70s now. For most of your adult life, though, how often were you teaching and training?
Well, it started off twice a week when I first started. Before I left England, I was training twice a day, 6 days a week.
Wow.
Would work my cabs at night, but I'd go to the black belt class at the Triangle, which ran from 10 till 12 by invite only. And I also taught a kids class at the Triangle, and we produced some really good kids who ended up world-class teams. Besides that, I'd train in the morning. Then my nightman would come off the cab at 5 o'clock, so I'd go down to the Triangle. The advanced class was always before the beginner's class at the Triangle, so I trained from 6 to 8. And then I'd go out and I'd work till 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, come home, have a sleep, and go to training at 10.
When you went to Canada and you had your own dojo, you kept up a very intense training schedule, didn't you? Like, you were training 6 days a week in Canada, from what I recall, is that right?
6, 7 days a week, yeah. 6, 7 days a week, yeah.
And that involved not just teaching, but also training yourself.
Yeah, I was on the floor. You had to do it, really. And that's what frustrates me getting older, is because I can't demonstrate as much as I want to. Although I've got some excellent students and they more or less know what I want. The frustrating thing about growing old, apart from obviously growing old, is the fact that you lose a lot of your abilities. Well, capabilities more than abilities, you know. In my mind, I can still do it. In my mind, I can do full splits, but I've never managed that. It's just the way things are.
So to be training 6 days a week, and you did that for decades, correct? Yeah. Where you're teaching and training every day, typically except Sunday, except, as you say, sometimes you did Sunday as well, right?
I often did Sunday, and I did Sunday. I do 2 classes on Sunday. I'd very often go to one of my other clubs in the city. So, yeah, I had a busy time, but it was all karate. And when it's something that you like doing, then it's not busy, it's just what you do.
Right, many of our listeners may never step into a dojo.
Yeah.
They don't know anything about karate other than what they see in popular media. But the idea of dedicating yourself to one art or one activity for your whole life, what are some of the rewards that come from that? And where did that dedication come from? Did you just have a sense that you would get a richness out of it that you wouldn't if you just did it as a part-time thing?
It never occurred to me to do it as a part-time thing. I didn't earn a living out of it. I had a job as well. And I worked at my job, and every moment I wasn't working at my job, I was doing karate. Or I was lucky enough when my boys were young, they certainly did karate with me. And that was fine. I never looked upon it as dedicating myself to it. It was just something that I did. It was part of me. I got a lot of satisfaction out of it. I never felt better than when I'd finished a really good session, pushed myself to the limits. And we did. I remember we trained once with Chris Walker, and this was a popular sports club, a proper sports club with gym and everything in there. And we used to weigh ourselves when we went in, and then we'd do a couple of hours training, and we'd come out and weigh ourselves. And often there was an 8-pound difference in weight. It was probably all hydration, but it just shows you how much we were putting into it. And we might spend 30 minutes running through basics or kicks or whatever, maybe 20 minutes on kata and probably an hour on kumite. A lot of Japanese teaching is by repetition, and repetition is a great way to do it. But if you're doing 1,000 maegaris or even 500 maegaris, which is a front snap kick, I'll guarantee you your 500th one looks nothing like your first one.
Something that strikes me is this emphasis on constant improvement. And the sense I get is that you're constantly improving yourself, but also you became very dedicated to helping others constantly improve themselves.
Yes.
Is that largely what you see your role has been, helping others develop their potential?
Yeah, after I realized that there wasn't anybody in my area who could teach me anything, and I'm not being big-headed about that. They wanted me to teach them, but that's not what I want to do. When I first came to Canada, my reasons of coming to Canada were purely financial. It wasn't an instant decision, of course. Anyway, that's why I came to Canada, and I was glad I did, although the atmosphere I worked in was very different. I had to get used to the way people addressed each other. I was always addressed by my surname in the UK. Everybody was addressed by their surname. Here, everybody wanted to call you by your Christian name. It took a long time to get me used to that, but that's the way it was. The other thing is, almost everybody wore a shirt and tie to work in the UK. And here, you just dressed how you liked.
Right. So the formality in the dojo where everyone wears a nice, crisp, clean gi, which is the karate outfit, the gi, and also they have formalities in terms of bowing and how you address each other.
All of that's a little bit of self-discipline, and I like to enforce that right from the very start. The first kind of discipline you're going to come across is self-discipline. How you conduct yourself, how you relate to others, your consideration of others for certain, consideration is a big deal. You have to be considerate of other people. Yours aren't the only needs that need to be met.
So in terms of the benefits of focusing yourself on one field of study and going deep in it, you've written about this in your books. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because, you've done Shotokan karate for, 54 years approximately now. And there are people who dabble in various martial arts and they claim to be experts in all of them, which is not likely. Can you talk a little bit about the value of the focus you've had on one art, even though you know lots about others as well, but the focus on one style of karate for so long, what's the benefit of that?
I think the benefit of it is you realise that it's not a part, it's not a single art. It has a single name, but it's not a single art. It encompasses all the other arts. I have a book there called Hapkido. It's one of the better books of mine, I think. And it's a large book. It's 700 or 800 pages, and it's a complete system. But when you look at it, and when I look at it anyway, it's just everything that I already know. But I wouldn't call myself a master of Hapkido. There's just different ways of doing it. It's the same as, for example, there's an SAS survival manual there. And the SAS survival, and I did SAS selection when I was with the Army. I never followed through with it because I'd done my time and I wasn't too happy with the Army. But just about everything in there is just common sense that is encompassed within a particular field. And when you master any kind of field, all you're doing is applying common sense to that discipline. And once that discipline, once you apply it to that discipline, you begin to see all the vagaries and differences and similarities that are involved with lots of other things. So, yeah, I studied Shotokan karate for 55 years, but it's no different than somebody who studied Goju-ryu karate or Shito-ryu karate for 55 years. They're going to tell you that they just know karate. That's it. Usually styles, you determine a style mostly by kata. If somebody's in the ring and they're fighting, you don't know what style they are. If somebody punches you in the mouth, I couldn't tell you, oh, that was a Goju guy or that was a Shito guy.
Yeah.
A punch in the mouth's a punch in the mouth.
Yeah. You talked earlier about the rough area that you grew up in, how devastated Liverpool was after World War II.
Yeah.
And you wrote in your book, Hanratty on Karate, about how the kids, certainly that you grew up around, some of them ended up in trouble and so on. How do you think your life could have turned out if you hadn't found that karate dojo and hadn't dedicated your life to that? Like, do you think your life could have turned out very differently?
Well, karate came quite late in my life. I'd already had a great deal of experience with the world. I'd been all around the world. I literally circumnavigated the world before I even heard about karate.
Right, so you were in the Merchant Navy for several years, correct?
I was in the Merchant Navy. I left, came up through the social system and foster homes and stuff, and I left at a very early age and got a job on the river and pilot boats, and as soon as I could, I got my merchant seaman's card, union book, and I went what we call going deep sea on various voyages all around the world. One of the last voyages I did was a complete circumnavigation out through the Panama, all the way around and back through the Suez, and every port in between. So you get a pretty wide view of life, and my inclination philosophically has always been towards Stoicism, so I would class myself as a Stoic. So you kind of weigh things up and you take the best of a situation, which is how I look upon my upbringing. I don't think I ever thought it was bad. It's like if you see a little kid playing football with a ball of plastic bags in Africa, he's not going to think that he's got a bad life unless somebody tells him. And I was exactly the same way. I didn't think I'd had it bad until I saw that there was better. And once I saw there was better, I wanted better. Right. But while I was at sea, well, even before I went to sea, I used to read. I read a lot. Far as I can remember, I've been able to read. Before I went to school, I could read. I don't know how, I just could. And I did. I read everything I could lay my hands on. And at sea, you got nothing else to do when you're off duty but read.
Now, you've taught thousands of students, not just here in Canada, but at seminars around the world.
Yeah. What
kind of difference do you hope you've made for students?
Well, it's very satisfying. I got an email only a few weeks ago, actually, from a dentist in New York, really, really nice guy. And he said I was probably one of the best influences he'd ever had, and he learnt more from me than anybody else. Now, I don't know. It's just different things. You find this with different people. Somebody will say something to you, and it might be the most sensible thing you've ever heard, but it doesn't sink in. And then maybe a week later, somebody else will say exactly the same thing using different words or in a different vernacular. And you'll go, oh, I've never heard that before. But of course you have. Now, I get that all the time with my students. I'll bring somebody in. I've never been shy at bringing people into the dojo. If I think they've got something to teach my students, then yeah, I'll bring them in. I've brought in hundreds of instructors from different parts of the world into my club. And then, as they come off the floor, one student will go, oh, I haven't heard that before. And I just hand to the face because I've been saying it for years. But they heard it in a different way, and that's okay. You get used to that. I don't care. As long as you understand the concept I was trying to get across, I don't care who gets it across to you. I'm not jealous in any way.
One other thing, this is kind of, I don't know if it's a tricky question, but a lot of people who've spent their life helping others and helping them in any way, serving others, they're often motivated by religious faith. You're open about the fact that you are not religious. I've heard you describe yourself as a card-carrying atheist.
Yep.
So to some people that might be surprising. They associate service with some belief in religion. Can you talk about what your beliefs are grounded in?
I don't believe in religion. I think it's obscene, to be honest with you. There's more trouble caused through religion than anything, and most evil people, dictators, what they'll do is they'll use religion as part of their doctrine to get their own way. Like you're seeing a good example of that with the evangelists in the States now, and a guy who's pretending to be somewhat Christian. But originally, I was brought up in a very Catholic area. Now, Catholicism has a particularly not so nice doctrines and dogma. So I think my first bump up against religion was in school. We had nuns, which they deserve all the reputation that they have. They're wicked. They are virgins by choice, and they think they know everything about child caring, even though they've never had kids. They think they're the give-all and be-all of how to bring up children. They abuse their positions, and I didn't go along with the dogma. None of it made sense. None of it at all.
So your sense of right and wrong clearly doesn't come from an organized religion. So
No.
Some people who are religious would say, well, if someone doesn't have religion, then they'll do anything to anybody, they'll be purely selfish, and yet you're a great example of someone who doesn't go around hurting people, has in fact dedicated your life to helping others improve themselves. So what are your core principles, and where do they come from? Just from rational thought, or where?
Yeah, I would say they're from rational thought, and religious people think that you have to be religious to be moral. People also think that being moral is being right. But you have to really think about that. And I don't think they get past the first part, being religious is being moral. Just because something's moral doesn't make it right. And being religious doesn't make you moral. There's more horrendous acts in the world done in the name of religion. They certainly aren't moral. People are inherently good. They are. You don't get religious babies. Babies are all atheists. And look how good babies are. But babies are all atheists. Now, you are where you're born. If I was born in Baghdad, I'd be Muslim. If I was born in Kentucky, I'd probably be some kind of snake-handling religious nut. It depends where you're born. Now, I was
just lost all our Kentucky listeners.
Yeah.
Keep going.
If I was born in an Irish religious community in Liverpool, which is mostly second and third generation Irish remnants from the famine. So I didn't really look at the religious part of it. I looked at why was the famine? Why did the people come here? That kind of gave me a background in which way I wanted to think. Now, as a kid, I'm not saying I knew absolute right from wrong than everybody else. But you develop your beliefs grow with you, and you automatically know what's right and wrong. Now, if your beliefs aren't allowed to grow, if you're constantly bombarded with dogma and ideologies, then your education is stunted. And this is what happened in the Middle Ages in England. That's why it's called the Dark Ages. All the education was contained in the church. It wasn't allowed to be out of the church. You weren't allowed to read and write. You weren't allowed to learn to read and write. And if you did, it was in Latin, which is kind of like a secret code. So they restrict the education. And once you restrict the education, you can tell them anything you want. They'll believe it. Right? And if you keep doing that, then you restrict free thought. which is how dictators get there. They just hammer you with the same message until you start to believe it, and that's it. If you're a free thinker, and I like to think of myself as a free thinker, then you find your own way. Now, it doesn't mean to say that I don't have any morals. I believe I have probably a lot more morals than, say, these mega pastors who wouldn't give you $1 if your house was on fire, but they've got $7 million mansions and cars. And it's exactly the same in any kind of religion, even Buddhism to a certain extent. The Buddhists that came into Japan were looked upon as a form of government administrators. They were good at it. You don't need religion to be moral. Morality is something that is for the good of the community. And I think if you're considerate to your community, they don't care who you believe in. And I don't care who you believe in either, to be honest with you. If you want to believe what you believe, then that's good. Just, you don't have to push it down anybody else's throat. I mean, I will even defend your right to believe in it. What you believe in is your own business.
But that's a good segue to the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're here in your home office, and what we see here, there are hundreds of books, and I really believe that if you want to know what someone thinks about and what matters to them, look at the books in their home. And you also have, of course, some objects in here and some pictures. Can you just give a few highlights of what we see when we look around your office?
Well, you see a fair amount of Russian and Japanese history books. There's a fair amount of fiction. I like fiction. There's some books on poetry, modern poetry, and we have Plutarch, which is one of my favourite books. What he did was he compared the lives of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. It's kind of like John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, if you like, but that's a much better book. There's a whole series of books on philosophy by Will Durant. Now, they're old books, so there's quite a little bit of misogyny and racism in there. But once you disregard that, the basic tenet of the thought is quite good. Now, as I mentioned before, I'm pretty much a Stoic, so you're going to get some Stoicism. There's Marcus Aurelius over there. There's one of my favourites. So I'm interested in philosophy and what people think and how people think and what makes them think like that. So I have Solzhenitsyn, who was a great Russian writer who had immense suffering in his life, but still put out some amazing literature. Dostoevsky. I like Dostoevsky, another great Russian who also went through a lot of suffering and mental turmoil.
Quite a variety, a lot of
engineering books for sure. To the Great Ocean is a really good engineering book. It's about the building of the Trans-Siberian Railway and the people who were involved with it. There's some nice first editions, old books, which I treasure those. I've a whole slew of karate books, and probably worth quite a lot of money. There's a lot of books there, and there's a fair amount of fiction. I like Mark Twain.
Definitely a free thinker himself.
Yeah, Mark Twain, one of my heroes. I thought he was quite an amazing mind. Besides being a humorist, in fact, I was in Italy once in a little town called Cessignon, north of Florence, and we were staying in an estate, a Strozzi estate, which was one of the old Strozzi palaces, friends of the princes in Florence at the time. Now, I wasn't a friend of the palace or anything. They had a bed and breakfast in the gamekeeper's cottage that I had rented. But I was out walking around the back lanes in Florence, a beautiful day, and I came across a plaque that was embedded into a wall on a very old overgrown lane. And I'm looking down, and there was like 6 or 7 names on it, and the very bottom one was Mark Twain.
Oh, wow.
And I looked it up because something interests me straight away. What I'll do is I'll go and find out why it interested me. And he spent some time there in his later years, and he wrote quite a bit there as well. But Florence is that kind of a city. It's one of my favourite cities in the world. Lots of poets there and stuff like that.
And in terms of the objects we see in your office, what are some ones that are meaningful to you? Like if your house is on fire, you can only take a few of them with you. Which ones would you want to take with you?
I don't know. I've quite a nice collection of samurai figurines over there. Mm-hmm. Some of them are quite old. I got from Japan, or I picked up around. That wooden Buddha is quite old. It's a carved wooden Buddha. Mm-hmm. I have a larger Buddha, and I have some katana and stuff. Some of my old belts, anyway. There's some.
Yeah, you see a couple of your old belts, and they're almost entirely white from the amount of wear. Sometimes you've mentioned the symbolic nature of that when a black belt goes back to white. Can you say something about that?
It's something like that. It's more like you study the old until it becomes the new, until you study the old again. It's just the cycle of history and the cycle of life. I don't know if I'd take anything, really. That's an old pair of army binoculars from 1945 that I managed to pick up somewhere. There's a Chinese screen. Can't remember where I got that, but somebody gave it to me maybe. And of course I have some different kanji around that people have done calligraphy for that I like. Some old pictures of Liverpool and some old pictures on the wall over there of the first ship I was on in the river. There's lots of stuff. I'd probably grab my Robert Frost collection of poetry if I had to run out with it. I like Frost.
Do you feel like you've taken a road less travelled?
No. I think I took the road well travelled, but I looked more at the trees on the way. So instead of just looking ahead, I had a good look around me at the trees and the bushes and the flowers. So I probably took the same road everybody else did, but maybe I paid more attention to it.
And maybe just to wrap up, can you talk a little bit about how you hope your students would describe you, what you hope your legacy is?
I would like for them to continue the way I did, but I can see little changes that they're making which probably reflect their personality, and I don't have any regrets with that. A few of the little traditions I started with the dojo I'd like to see carried on, but they probably won't. Times change and so do certain things. I'm an impetuous, impulsive at times person, and so if I say I want to do something, I'll do it within the next hour, right? And nowadays I don't see that trend. People tend to, well, there's no rush, and that's not me, right? If they all go, Sensei, we'd like to do a Japanese trip, I'll go, right. And I'll get on and I'll book all the flights and everything else, and I'll go, we're booked, we're leaving then. And I go, oh, well, I can't go then. Too late, I booked it. That's it. You give me a task, it's done. I always believe in the old saying, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. Because they'll do it right away.
But let's say it's years and hopefully many years from now, and a new student comes into the dojo, they see your picture on the wall, and they ask the instructor, oh, who's that? What do you hope they would say about you?
I would hope they would say that the guy was really good at karate and taught us everything we know, and we're going to try and teach you the same way. I doubt that they would, because the ways change, but I hope that they would. How would they just say, oh, that's Sensei Hanratty, and that's the guy who started us all out on this path? Hopefully they'll stick with it.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Sensei Hanratty.
Oh, no problem.
I think you've shared a lot of valuable wisdom, not just for people who have been in the martial arts, but just anybody who's looking for more of a sense of purpose in their life, and maybe they just need to pick something and go deep with it and discover the richness that comes from that.
Yeah. You can take a surface knowledge of anything, but it's eventually going to fail you in some way. So unless you know about one thing really deeply, and the deeper you go, the further out it spreads to encompass probably all the little things that you thought you should be studying anyway.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you again. You've been very generous with your time. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, you're welcome.